Employers of Reddit that do a background check on Facebook. What's the most disturbing thing you have seen? I wouldn't necessarily call it disturbing, but it was the deciding factor in not hiring somebody. We interviewed a guy for an entry-level position. His interview went well, and the other two people on the hiring committee were enthusiastic about him. But something about him bothered me. I don't normally check applicants out on Facebook, but I decided to in this case. His most recent post was something to the tune of, "Just got fired again. This is so much bullcrap." Someone asked him in the comments what happened, and his response was, "It was my third no-call, no-show. I was too hungover to bother. Those a whole had it coming for scheduling me right after a holiday." Entitled "Irresponsible and Daft Enough to Broadcast It in a Public Post? Sign me up." Story 2, pictures of them smoking or being belligerently drunk. Not that I personally care, but you're just asking for trouble, especially if you're going into a public sector job. Think of it as a reference, only you're the one giving the feedback on yourself. I actually had one kid whose profile picture was him naked, cupping his junk with the caption, "Junk's out for Harambe." Did I mention he had applied to our marketing and social media internship? Story 3, he was hired before I started, much before, but I'd been doing an audit of our files, and I noticed his background check had a conviction for molestation or something like that in the 80s. This was a man my boss regularly had play Santa at Christmas parties, where children would sit on his lap. This was the moment I realized the president of the company was a total idiot. But that guy got fired for insubordination like a year ago, so there's that. Story 4, I work for a background screening company. We do not do social media checks, though we are incredibly thorough, because it can lead to a world of problem. For instance, if you find out that applicant is gay and deny him the job because he has a criminal record or something, he can claim discrimination and sue. Consumers have to be provided a copy of their background check after the research is done, so they will see that a social media search was conducted. Hope this makes sense. Story 5, not Facebook, but I used to work in a department that did background checks on potential childcare employees. One guy had been charged with abuse when he worked at a daycare. He was out on bail and applying to work in a different daycare. The problem was that he had only been charged, and there was no conviction yet, so he didn't show up on any of the registries. I don't remember how I found out about the charge, but it was an accident. I think it was maybe a newspaper article or something. Story 6, the place at which I am a board member fired someone this week for social media, posting pictures of vulnerable individuals and making fun of people on a personal Facebook. A family member notified staff about the posting. The staff member thought it was outrageous to be fired from the camp for special needs kids for the posts. Story 7, not an employer, but handle work comp claim. Just had a guy claiming complete incapacity while going on 4 trips to Asia and back, as well as hyping his business, all on his Facebook page. Just sent a subpoena for his business records, so should be fun. Story 8, red pill and pages they've liked or commented on. Some guy had an incredible resume and interviewed really well. Then we saw his comment. Yikes, we passed. Story 9, I get assigned interns to work with me based on a term or year from the university nearby. I make it a habit to do a quick Facebook search so I'll recognize their faces from the dozen other interns when they come in. Lots of party pics, smoking pics, legal here, so in the same realm as those party pics, and women in almost no clothing, also lots of mirror ab shots, though my field is largely female-dominated, and all I look for is the profile picture. I don't do any digging. All the interns I've actually seen get hired have had very normal profile pictures, smiling with friends on a hike, etc. Not because of their pics, but because they're the type of people who understand professional versus private life and what is appropriate for public viewing. Story 10. I was doing background checks for the British Airport Authority during a massive hiring drive in 2007 after there was an attempt to drive a car full of gas canisters into the terminal of Glasgow Airport by 2 Islamists. Due to the need to hire several thousand staff in a few months, the normal requirements relating to job stability, etc. were relaxed. So people who hadn't worked in 20 years were getting interviewed, which led to a few interesting ones. The only one which I can remember in detail was a guy from Belfast. He hadn't worked since 1990, but they were willing to give him a chance. When we checked his history, he had spent 5 years in Hemp Maze due to being convicted of terrorist offenses before being released as part of the Good Friday Agreement. It turned out that the guy spent his life applying to jobs with long recruitment processes that he couldn't get due to his conviction, as that meant he was seen as an active job seeker and wouldn't lose his benefits. Strangely enough, he wasn't invited for an interview. Story 11, I was trying to hire a nanny. This girl sends me her application. Everything looks really good. So I put her phone number into FB to see what she is like and add her to mine. Her background photo is a girl, her, stand with a bra and panties on, and a guy about to do a line offer. I was going to send her an email saying, due to your FB page, I will not be interviewing you. My husband told me not to help out other parents she is trying to get a job from. Story 12. We had a 40-something lady apply, and whilst doing usual checks, we went to her Facebook to find her profile pictures of her husband, and her daughter at a party, all completely nude, and her with a different man behind her. We were dumbstruck. Story 13. It's not disturbing, but a good story. Before my company had HR, I did the interviews with a couple other people. I interviewed this girl who seemed like a good fit. After the interview, I looked her up on Facebook. She had just posted, "I just had a job interview, and I think it went well. The pay is crap, though." The pay wasn't crap, considering she had no experience. So my first thought was the obvious. I'm not going to hire her. Later that evening, I was in Target, and I happened to see her there. She didn't see me. She had this big smile on her face and an awesome aura of someone who is very positive. The next day, I hired her. 5 years later, she worked her way up pretty high. She has an awesome career in digital marketing now. She has no idea. Story 14. A guy who said he had an assault charge 15 years ago. He wasn't lying, but that was the start of 27 pages of criminal history that included 2 years of incarceration, during which time his app said he was self-employed as a carpenter. The history was predominantly assaults, thefts, and possession of illegal substances. I had never before seen 27 pages of criminal history on one person. I will add this, though. He actually did turn his life around. He ended up working at the gym I went to and then got an additional job at a seafood distributor. I never would have guessed that he was the guy that would turn it all around, but he did. Story 15. I interviewed a guy in his late 50s. Hadn't worked for years, as he had been a single parent to 4 kids. He passed the interview support position working with elderly people. We then went on to discuss a DBS check, which is where you check any criminal record. He said it would be fine. He didn't have a record. He then asked me about how long records stay on the system for. I said, what I am looking for? Forever. Oh, he said, well, I do have something to admit to. My wife said I shouldn't say anything, but I guess I will have to. When my first wife left, I couldn't work, so I got involved in adult films. I'm not sure how, but it led to film CP and was sent to prison. The room went silent. I honestly did not know what to say. I was just aware I was in a room alone in an empty office with this disgusting, vile man. He must have known and said, I will take it. I haven't got the job. I said, no, sorry, and he left. I wish I had said more, but I was so shocked and a bit scared. Story 16. I'm not a manager, but most of my team participates in interviewing potential teammates. I was preparing for an interview, and I routinely Google their names to see what comes up. In the past, I've been pleasantly surprised to find industry-related accolades that the applicant was too humble to list on their resume. But this time, I came up with a long string of blog posts. I got sucked into the rabbit hole at that point, and the next 2 hours were spent reading all of these blog entries about his wife who was involved in widespread internet trolling and bullying. There were websites dedicated to how horrible this woman was. People invested in domain names related to the message and paid for hosting just to call her out. So I was left with quite the dilemma. As a result of her bullying, her victims and opponents had dedicated quite a bit of time to doxing her, and as a result, her husband and his employer. I figured I would hold on to this information and only inform my boss if we all felt he was a solid candidate that we would hire. The guy came in for the interview, and while I was asking him questions the whole time, I was thinking about his insane wife, but not saying a word. He somehow worked into the conversation that he had recently divorced, which at the moment further complicated the issue in my mind. When we met as a team after the interviews to discuss how he performed, my boss said he wasn't impressed with his responses to the technical questions and didn't seem like a good fit for the team, which was a huge relief to me. I'm not certain what the right call would have been had he been a good fit. It would be wrong to judge him based upon his ex-wife's actions, but if there's an army of people on the internet targeting her husband's employer in efforts to get him fired, that can be a headache to deal with. Story 17. Illegal discharge of a firearm from a moving vehicle causing great bodily harm. Man, why bother trying when we said no felons? My boss interviewed him to maybe find out if it was an accident. Nope. Hit his brother in a heated argument after a drive-by they did together. Said brother is now a quad. It's for a bail bondsman agency, too. Git. Story 18. I check Facebook for all my hires. I love the ones who have their page public, so I get to see all their crazy. Seriously, why try to get a job when you've worked at 10-plus jobs in the past year and laugh when you get fired for not doing your job, or when you post photos of doing stupid crap at work, or talking about your substances use and partying every night, or baby daddy drama, or like when you keep getting locked up in county over and over, or when you leave a ton of negative reviews for other small businesses acting like servers. Are your servants when you are applying for a server position, or baby mama drama, or... These are just the ones I remember of the top of my head, and all these are actual things seen. FYI, be smart people. Hide that crap. Story 19. One guy's profile picture was him with a Friar Tuck haircut, doing Edward 40 hands. He had a great interview, but he had to know we were going to check social media. I Googled a gal who gave us her resume, and she had killed her mother when she was young. Story 20. This is why I have 2 Facebook profiles. One is very private, search turned off, and posts and friends list set to private. Profile picture doesn't show my face. Then I have another feed that is very open with pictures of me doing outdoor activities, helping at an animal shelter, posting very positive messages, and member of local groups that look good or show interest in my field of work. My public fee is just that, public. It's the same stuff I really do, and nothing is fake about it. The private FB that I actually use is locked down, and I don't want to worry about switching between making public posts and private ones want it. If I only had my private FB, someone may ask to see it. If this sounds paranoid, it's only because I work in corporate security and always have stuff like that on my mind. Story 21. I was hiring for a position as a cashier at my gas station, going through resumes and see a guy who's currently going to USC or UCLA, can't remember which, and had minimal retail experience. But I figured everyone's got to start somewhere. So I decided to give him a call for a phone interview. It goes to voicemail and I leave a message and decide I'll see if I can find him on Facebook. I end up finding him and his profile picture is him with a red bandana holding. I figured, hey, maybe it's just a sarcastic picture, right? I start scrolling through his photos, posts, and they are all of just himself or in a group of guys all holding up the blood gang sign. He calls me back while I'm in a meeting and he leaves me a voicemail. He spoke in an intelligent manner and seemed well-mannered, but unfortunately, I had made my choice on a new hire and decided to at least give him a courtesy call, thanking him for his application so that he's not in limbo land. I call and thank him and apologize that the position is filled, but if another opens up, he is first on my list for interviews. Dude goes off, full on Ebonics at this point, cursing me out, being aggressive and threatening me. I hang up and block his number. I tried really hard to not judge him by his Facebook profile and figured, hey, maybe it's just some long-running sarcastic joke with him and his friends holding up gang signs as they attend UCLA or USC. Whether he was or wasn't a gang member, IDK, but he certainly couldn't handle rejection. 2 weeks later, a position did open up. He sent in his resume again when I posted the job listing online. Story 22. Oh boy. I once interviewed a guy for an entry-level manufacturing position. He was in his mid-30s, I guess. And he seemed all right, if not a little socially awkward, and mentioned he wanted the job because he had a baby on the way and wanted something solid as he was picking up odd jobs with a relative's company. This job required basically no skill, so we hired nearly everyone we interviewed. After he left, I went back to my desk and looked him up on Facebook. He was obsessed with Rihanna, photoshopped himself into pictures with her, had her as his cover photo, and had a lot of softcore hot with her head photoshopped onto the models. Nearly every one of his status updates were about her. It was ducking weird as hell. The kicker, though, was that his profile picture was him with a photoshopped picture of a pregnant Rihanna with his hand on her belly. He did not get a call back. Story 23. Not an employer and not about me. My mother does this about some of her customers. On Amazon and eBay, she's a third-party seller on both sites, over Facebook. She once got an order and looked on the person's Facebook. The person was bragging repeatedly there about how she'd scammed multiple Amazon sellers out of inventory and got her money back. She canceled the order for the textbook via Amazon. The customer asked her why she canceled it. Mom reported that customer, and that pointed out to the customer she shouldn't have her Facebook set on public mode if she wants to scam sellers. I heard that customer was banned from Amazon soon after that. Story 24. This is why I pretty much only talk about hockey, cooking, and my yard on Facebook. I guess I won't get hired by someone who has allergies or hates the Blackhawks, but otherwise, I should be okay. Story 25. I'm not an employer, but a few years after I resigned from a job that I'd worked at for years, I found I needed to contact my old GM. I called where I used to work and discovered he had quit, so I decided to look him up online. That's when I discovered that the guy I was working for prior to him becoming my GM had 2 Met convictions under his belt. I can't judge, though. He was one of the most awesome people I've ever worked for. I just thought it was funny. Story 26. There was this applicant for a big, important job, and he kept tweeting about people that were low IQ, calling them liars constantly, and even going so far as to lie about a woman he had barely met, saying that people should check out her hot tape and stuff. I didn't want to hire the guy, but he was elected president anyway. Story 27. Sort of on topic, had an intern that was working with our social media marketing group. She put in a really hateful ticket about how she needed Facebook open on the web gateway, filter for her job. So one of the guys on our team looked her up on social media, just kind of interested. Here was a big long post about how incompetent it was at my company, and how she had to get on her personal cell phone to browse. We all thought her boss should see her post. She was gone the next day. Story 28. This was actually on MySpace back in the day. I was hiring for a position that involved review of patient medical records in a hospital setting, and as you can imagine, involved a great deal of confidentiality and discretion by the person hired for the position. One of the applicants worked at a bank, but had some prior experience in the medical field, so I was considering her for the position. I checked out her MySpace page and found tons of pictures of her in the bank vault, in her undies, posing suggestively with large amounts of money. The content of the pictures themselves didn't bother me so much as her complete lack of discretion and stupidity in posting. Those pictures publicly where any of her employers might have found them. I was disgusted thinking about what she may have done with others' private health information if we had hired her. Story 29. I recently took a promotion and am working on my replacement in my prior role. The job requires you to be extremely reliable and able to work with generally no supervision. We are taking our time and doing several levels of interviews as well as informal meetings, such as dinners or lunches. Those tend to catch people off guard, and I get free food. 2 weeks ago, I was poking around a lady's FB page, and most of it was pretty normal, until I found her comment on an article about a cop hit a dog. She referenced the owners of the dog as monkeys and sided with the cop on hit the chained-up dog. Her profile was extremely professional except for the article comments. The monkey comment was just the tip. Story 30. This wasn't me, and it wasn't for hiring purposes, but at my old job, I worked as a cashier. 2 of my male coworkers were mucking around in the break room, and one of them sat on the other's lap in a non-dirty manner. My female coworker took a picture of it, and it became someone's profile picture. When it was cropped, it just looked like a side hug was happening, but the full pic showed the lap. The pic ended up getting reported to head office, and those 2 boys were fired. My female coworker was forced to go to a sexual harassment seminar and was put on probation. I could understand all this because it's about protecting the company, except that every single woman, myself included, in the store had made numerous complaints against the grocery manager for being lewd, making sexual comments, and just being creepy. They didn't do a single thing, not even when he asked me if I would dye my pubes red to match my hair. Not even when he told me he used extra-large condoms because the smaller ones were too tight. Yeah, right, buddy. He still works at that store in the same position. I guess since the customers don't see it, it doesn't matter. Story 31. Used to be a staffing consultant and had to background check everyone. Had somebody have first-degree murder pop up. That was pretty weird considering we do the backgrounds while they are in the office. Had another guy have pop, and he wanted to explain. He and some friends broke into a co-op and put all the feed against the door, so the owner couldn't get in. It was meant to be a prank, and now it's on his record. My supervisor wouldn't let hire him, which I thought was lame. Don't do dumb things as adults, kids. Story 32. Not disturbing. The opposite. We interviewed a kid who was a total bag of nerves but seemed good otherwise, just bad at interviews. When we looked him up, his Facebook said something like, "Crashed and burned in an interview today, really down." I would have loved to get that job. We had a big discussion about whether it was genuine, but I figured if he was playing us, it was worthy of a reward anyway. He worked out great. Story 33. There was a pre-op transgender applicant that had a picture of herself passed out from drinking with one ball hanging out. I'm fine with stuff like that, but it'd be more appropriate to set that as a private post. Story 34. Not an employer, but someone who was checked on as part of a freelance gig I did last year. They genuinely didn't understand why I had an FB account, but didn't use it. I haven't logged in for months and have only ever used it to write silly jokes, rather sharing images or life stories or spam or cat videos. When discussing my main film, music work or traveling or family or general shenanigans, they couldn't get their head around me, not logging it or having the need to tell someone about it all the time. It was a weird conversation. I nearly turned down that role after that meeting. However, they were willing to pay my required rate. I suggested something much higher than normal, as I was kind of hoping they wouldn't pick me for being too expensive. So I didn't care about their nonsense behavior in the end. Story 35. Called a young lady in for an interview and kind of liked her, but she acted a little odd. Checked her FB and it was like reading trees. It dawned on me that she had been high during the interview. No. Story 36. I am a recruiter, and when I'm screening someone over the phone, I will use their cell number to pull up their Facebook profile. Yep, most of you have your phone number publicly associated, linked to your account, because personality fit is so important with most of the hiring managers. I will see if you like to cause trouble or might not pass a substances test because you like to post pictures of yourself smoking blunt. Most of the time I ask, why did you leave your last job? And often they will say something like layoff. And around that time on their FB timeline, there will be some post about how their manager is a git and they walked out Jerry Maguire style. Lesson here is unlink your phone number from your public FB page. Story 37. I used to work for a recruitment agency. One of our recruitment consultants worked with a candidate to get her a high-level job with a new high-profile client. None of them would ever do background checks as they were all too bothered about getting their commission, and their goal was getting placements at any cost. It backfired because the client Googled the candidate after they'd gotten the job, and they had paid us. Turned out the candidate was wanted with Interpol for international fraud. We had to pay thousands of euro back to the client and lost their business. Needless to say, background checks are very important. The consultant should have been fired, but she was one of those women that cried on demand to manipulate, and my boss was weak, so she kept her job. Story 38. I looked up an applicant's Facebook page and found photos of them having a Ritz cracker eaten out of her. It was a series of photos taken from a drunken party with friends. It showed the progression of them opening the box of crackers, drinking too much wine, carefully putting a Ritz inside crack, and then a close-up of another girl eating the cracker out of her. If it hadn't been for those photos, I would have hired her. I ran into her several years later at another company, and she seemed like a nice person. She had a couple kids and seemed to have settled down in life by that point. I never mentioned why I didn't hire her. Story 39. I'm a manager in a recruitment agency, and I've seen almost all. Arson, check. Selling weapons? Guns are a big deal here, Europe. Check. Abuser? Check. That one was a bit awkward, being a woman, asking for a criminal record, and him telling that it had abuse on it. Check. Worst was a pedo. He looked the part so hard, it was almost unbelievable. Tall, freakishly skinny, old, huge. Story 40. Not so much Facebook, but I will Google people. I Googled an applicant we interviewed and seemed to like. Unfortunately, their top results were losing their nurse credentials for writing fake prescriptions for controlled substances a few years back, and a recent police arrest for driving under the influence and having prescription substances without a prescription. It actually made me sad, as they seemed likable but off. Unfortunately, not in a place to risk trusting someone with such a poor history of judgment and addiction issues. Story 41. Not an employer, but I've had this backfire on me. Have a fairly uncommon name, but by chance there is a person who's the same age as me and went to the same school. This person has no photos of his face on his profile, but a bunch of pictures of weed, bongs, FTP statuses. The last 2 jobs I applied for, it was very difficult to say it wasn't me. The worst part was trying to explain that I didn't have a Facebook, which when you say is for privacy reasons, people think you're some kind of crazy conspiracy theorist. Story 42. Not an employer, but an employee that works third shift. A few months ago, we were in need of people, so we were taking just about any application. So, on a slow night, our AGM decided to look people up on Facebook that had applied, all public account. One of the applicants had in their description, "Work is for pussies, swag for life." Needless to say, that person didn't get hired. As for myself, the AGM from the story above mentioned that he couldn't find me, which is a good thing. And yes, I do have a Facebook account. Story 43. At the company I work, each department supports different types of doctors. A guy had been hired to the pediatrics team, had been working for a few months, and then was gone. Found out afterwards that he used to be a high school teacher, but was fired and sent to prison for molesting a student. Pediatrics team? Story 44. A friend boss just hired that guy for a provincial government job. The guy had a particular name, and my friend thought it was familiar. After a quick Facebook search, he found out that the guy had been arrested and was waiting for his trial for having committed fraud at his last job. On Facebook, he was talking about his lawyer and how everyone was against him. His last job, the provincial government. So what happened to the boss who hired that guy? He was promoted, of course. Story 45. I was the potential candidate in this scenario, and it was my Instagram, but I applied for a job as a receptionist at a real estate office. Before this job, I worked at a gentleman's club, and my Instagram was still public. Their response and subsequent denial was liking the one photo of me in my old uniform. I changed my settings after that. Story 46. Student with an excellent part-time job here. Thought I got hired because I was capable and friendly, but it turns out that I only got an interview and was hired because Facebook showed I was young, skinny, and blonde. My now ex-boss told me when he was drunk once. My new boss, same place, was hiring people recently, other students, and was asking us about them. Then going through Facebook page, plenty of irresponsible pictures, subsentences, alcohol abuse, and nasty statuses. Story 47. Not an employer, but when I was working at my last job, my supervisor would always come up in my suggested friends. I'm quiet and reserved, so she was probably curious. Had a goofy, meme, and a cover photo of Louis Theroux at the time. Don't think it would have been too disturbing. Story 48. I want to know how far these background checks go. Will they try to submit friend requests to view private profiles? Do they have shadowy ways to connect my anonymous online accounts with me? Story 49. Went to look up someone that had sent in their resume a year or so ago. We were really short-staffed at work and started looking back at formerly rejected resumes. When we searched her on FB, we found out that the lady Pat. Story 50. Went through check a guy that had applied. Has a generally locked down page, but all of the public stuff he'd shared was extremely anti-government, tinfoil hat bullcrap. We hold several local and state government contracts, so that crap is a no-go. Story 51. I haven't found anything while interviewing people, but I did Facebook. Google check potential roommate. One of them was arrested for escort a couple of years ago. Not exactly disturbing, but needless to say, she didn't become my roommate. Story 52. Yeah, the mall security officer we hired had so many posts of himself. After 6 months with captions like today, I had to beat down and arrest 6 abuser, gangbangers, armed robbers today. They cried while we put them in the cop car, not the image we wanted to project. He was termed. Story 53. She had a few paragraph-long diatribe complaining that she didn't get hired because of her tattoos and piercings and how those jeets were discriminatory. I made sure that I didn't meet her in person before I told her we weren't hiring. Employers of Reddit. What is the most scandalous thing you have ever encountered during a background check of an applicant? Story 1. My dad owns a business and had a resume of someone who he thought was perfect for the job, maybe a little too perfect. So he called up the man's recent employer and asked about him. Apparently, the guy photoshopped 7 of his previous coworkers into illegal situations, smoking substances, drinking on the job, and got all of them fired. My dad did not hire that man. He was applying for a graphic design job. Story 2. Not a background check, but a good story. Hired a guy, he was 50 or so. Everyone liked him. My client even interviewed and liked him. One day he doesn't show at his office off-site. Call him, no answer. Next day, same story. Day after, no change. On the 4th day at 10 p.m., my phone rings. It's another employee yelling for me quickly to turn it to a channel. Turns out my employee made the lead story. He went to a bar, picked up a girl, and they went to his place. Starts popping medics like Tic Tacs and abused her repeatedly over the next few days. He finally passes out due to exhaustion, and she escapes and is picked up by police naked, running down the road. His Biggie check was spotless. You never know. Story 3. I've told this before and it didn't progress all the way to a background check, but I was interviewing a guy for a mechanic position in a plant. We were reviewing his work history when he nonchalantly volunteered that he had spent several years in prison for abuse. Story 4. I'm actually the employee. When I applied for my first job, I got a call saying something came up when they did the background check. I was surprised because my background check should have been completely clean. Never even gotten a speeding parking ticket. But something came up that happened in the next state over in 1994. I was born in 1990. I had to fill out a bunch of paperwork, fax documents, and just basically go through a lot of hassle to prove that I wasn't the world's most badass little 3-year-old. Story 5, not so much scandalous as funny. I worked for a payroll division of company one summer. We dealt with taking out employees who had not worked for the company in over a year. My supervisor's job was to call any new applicants who had checked yes that they had a felony. She calls this woman up and speaks with her for a few minutes and hangs up, bursts out laughing. We asked what was up, and this girl has a record because she was driving a boat in Florida and accidentally hit a manatee. She said that was one of the dumbest reasons she heard someone having a record. Story 6. Had a guy apply for a teaching position, called his previous employer, and the way they spoke of him raised an alarm. Googled his name and school district and found out he lost his job for sex with employers. I'm not sure why he wasn't in jail or still had his license. Story 7. I was interviewing a guy for a manager position and was planning on hiring him. Mentioned that he'd have to do a background check. Straight out said he would not pass because of an armed robbery and assault charge. Seemed like a normal guy to me. Story 8. Did you know that when you get substances tested, they also test for alcohol? I didn't know that, but someone we were about to hire was legally drunk when they peed for their substances test. Since there is some interest, I'll give some additional details. My boss interviewed this person, then had them come back for a follow-up interview, and I interviewed them as well, mostly discussing video games. Then, from what I understand, a day or two later, my boss called and offered them the job starting the following Monday, but they needed to take a substances test before they started, so they needed to call and make an appointment for some time over the next couple of days. Monday came, and I was like, so, is new person starting today? Boss was like, no. They failed their substances test. For what? Alcohol? They test for that? Yep. Apparently new person was above the legal limit for alcohol at like 10 a.m. on a Thursday? Yep. At a test that they scheduled the time for? Yep. Story 9. I worked in a sandwich shop in London for a while. 2 of the girls there were always up to some crap and stole more ingredients and food than most. I'm pretty sure both were treating the place as a free supermarket. But whatever, I can't deny I sneaked a few free dinners myself. Hey, I was a student. One day I went to the bathroom to find them walking out with 2 long bread rolls and big grins on their faces. I saw the same bread rolls later under the counter. A certain man came in and ordered 2 large bread rolls with filling. One took them from under the counter and began to prep them. I asked the other what was up as she was watching and trying not to laugh. She told me the guy was a creep and they didn't like him, so they ran the bread rolls around the toilet bowl and other thing. Apparently, he would always order the same thing. I immediately walked over to the prep area, faked a trip, and sent both preps to the floor, and they had to be remade with new bread. I later told the manager, and both were fired on the spot. I left a few shifts later as the other workers there didn't seem too pleased with my actions. I don't care how creepy the guy was. He was a little slimy, but I thought more just socially awkward. Nobody deserves that kind of crap. I also took the time to report the outlet to the head office. I had been in there since, and it did seem like entirely new staff working there. Story 10. Someone who did 20 years in prison for murder. Someone else who was arrested for attempted murder. Someone else who was arrested for throwing oranges at people. All of these people were hired. Story 11. I wasn't responsible for hiring the individual, but I was one of his managers. After a few complaints from both customers and his coworkers, I started to urge upper management into looking through this guy's background, because something didn't seem right. Sure as a crap, he was let go from his previous workplace for harassing someone, and he had been to jail for domestic abuse. Best part, someone at corporate ran his background check before he was hired and still offered him a job. Story 12. Funny flip side story. I was interested in going back to school to become a teacher, and a friend of mine knew of a part-time instructional assistant job that I could apply for. Well, I go through the interview process and get to the point where I'll be hired depending on a background check. Well, I didn't have a driver's license or any other photo ID. I could not obtain a driver's license for a few more months because of reason. So there was my dilemma. Need-I'd for background check, need background check for job. I inform my new employer of this predicament, and they let me know that it's okay. There's a 30 grace period from the date of hire to the date that I need to have the background check completed by. What? So I said cool and showed up to work, totally helping kids with math and monitoring recess. Working with kids aged 7 to 12 with nothing more than my friends saying I was an okay guy as proof that I wasn't some wacko. I tried everything state-eyed. No. Waiting period was longer than my grace period. Costco membership, apparently an acceptable form of photo ID. Nope. Need a photo ID to get a photo Costco ID. Oh, now it makes sense. But wait a minute. I have this badge that I was issued at the school. It has my picture and my name. By badge? Of course, I mean the Mrs. Paint creation done by the librarian on my first day, laminated by said librarian. It was the only time I ever spoke to the librarian, so I took my badge down to the sheriff's office to get fingerprinted, and my background check was complete. All I had to do to get the job was to complete and pass a background check, providing photo ID obtained from the job that I needed the background check to get. Story 13. In my company, standard practices do search on their name, phone number, and email addresses from their CV. Occasionally, it turns up interesting factoids like patent applications, directorships, etc. A few years ago, a guy sent in his CV and it read excellently. He was called for interview. Morning of interview, I do the basic search and the guy's email turned up all his personal ads where he was looking for hung guys to duck his, stuff about role play and other, looking for information on best places for cruising in several different cities, plus his nude pics. It throws a zillion red flags on the web filter and I get called into HR. Explain, and it's all good. I get asked to sit in on interview and the guy aced it. Bright, qualified, well-presented, knew his stuff inside and out. An hour later, he got offered the job, but turned it down because not enough international travel. He took a lower-paying job at a competitor and travels a lot in Europe. Hopefully, he found the right kinky guy to keep him happy. TLDR applicants' kinky personal ads get me an interview by HR. He still didn't accept the damn job. Story 14. A friend of mine was asked to review candidate resumes for a technical position, and one of the resumes was copied verbatim from my friend's own resume down to the last detail. The guy applying had found the resume somewhere, changed the name and contact details, and didn't even change the formatting. My friend had a good laugh about it, busted the guy for submitting a false resume, and forgot about it. 3 weeks later, the guy who had copied the resume had the audacity to threaten to sue for racial discrimination. Now, since I was clearly the most qualified candidate, the only reason they had for not hiring me was that I'm Indian. My friend's company lawyered up, presented him with the concrete evidence that he had stolen someone else's resume and faked his credentials and employment history, and proceeded to blacklist the guy in. Unfortunately for the git in question, was a very small industry. Ironically, the guy did have the skills and credentials to cut it in the job he applied for, but apparently faked a better resume so he could argue for a higher starting salary, burned his bridges, and rendered himself unemployable in a field that he had worked hard to get a foot in the door. Stupidity on almost every level. Story 15. My sister's boss found out not through a background check, but through word of mouth, which was later verified that the IT guy there had been convicted of taping ladies in the shower, also pleasure, in their shampoo. Story 16. Not an employer, but we tried to get an apartment with an old friend one time, and the apartment complex did our background checks and was told to come in to explain something. Now, our friend has had a rough past, but he truly changed into a better man, an actual productive member in society, if you will. We knew he would have some stuff that would show up that still haunts him from the past, but we were hoping that since it's been so long ago that maybe they would be forgiving. Anyway, the lady checked my record, clean. My wife's record, clean. When she did his record, we very quickly realized that he wasn't entirely thorough with us about his past. The lady looks at us, looks back at the screen, and just sits there. I'm thinking, okay, we'll say his name is Fred. Fred, what the hell didn't you tell us? She so very calmly asks, so, can you explain what this felony possession of weapon of mass destruction is all about? Mine and my wife's faces both go white, and slowly look at Fred with a look of, what the serious duck on our faces, only to find him grinning and chuckling, saying, haha. Oh yeah, I forgot about that one. To make an even longer story short, in most states, it's a felony to be in possession of a modified weapon, such as a modified pistol that he failed to tell us about. And no, we didn't get the apartment. Story 17. 248 counts of abuse, tampering with evidence, and creation design of obscene material. Apparently, he was secretly videotaping using the bathroom, then selling it online. Story 18. I'm not a manager, but one of my coworkers was fired recently because of me. I work in a fairly small office, and this guy was someone I worked closely with. He and I shared an office with another coworker. Both myself and other coworker are female. For a year and a half, he started walking around the office with his banana hanging out of his pants. I honestly thought it was an accident because he was a really nice guy, went to church multiple times a week, had a wife he'd been married to for years, owned a home, and had 2 kids, and he was just generally a nice dude. Until one day he walked up to me and started asking me a bunch of questions about a hobby of mine that he's not interested in, and at the end of the convo, I noticed his junk was hanging out of his pants. All the previous times he'd been coming from going to the bathroom, this time he specifically stopped washing dishes to come talk to me. I ended up telling my boss after the weekend, and the guy said it was an accident due to weight loss. The guy was not wearing underwear when it happened. And my boss said he'd lost the same amount of weight before and hadn't had any pants-related problem, and not intentional. My boss ended up firing him the next day, and the guy confessed that it was something he'd had problems with in the past, and that he'd gone to counseling for, but that he fell back into old habits. He immediately went back to counseling, which is the one plus side. Story 19. About a year ago, we had a position open in marketing, various basic programming languages needed, knowledge of online marketing principles, and brand strategies. The usual. Our final stages of the interview had a woman against another woman. The first woman, not as qualified on paper, but was a whiz. Great personality and extremely bright. Always came in prepared, and our interviews would run over from her enthusiasm and ideas. The other, very qualified on paper, but not much of a standout. We gave them both an assignment to complete prior to their last interview. Basically gave them a mock site, and to see how they'd advertise it online with $0. Budget plus, they needed to build a few pages uses our basic CMS system. The first woman excels at the assignment. The second doesn't even complete it. In their final interview, they have to give a presentation. The second woman did not even remember to prepare a presentation and stumbled through winging it. The first woman had a PowerPoint, brought her own projector, had handouts, everything. The first woman's references are glowing. The second woman's are generic and unenthusiastic. My boss and I didn't agree on who to hire. It seemed obvious to me until my boss revealed that the second woman was the daughter of someone on the board, which was all my boss cared about. My boss says, if everything checks out, she'll try to give the first woman something, but definitely not this position. We get to the background portion. I see that my favorite candidate has a major adult site listed under her former employers. I call the company and they say she was an amateur online performer, cam girl, basically. I ask if she's done anything else for them except that I can write down. They say no. My boss disqualifies her. I was shocked because she looked like a very professional career woman in her early 30s. She had a degree and was well-spoken and not at all what you'd expect. She basically didn't seem like the type, but in the period the company said she worked for them. She had a long unpaid internship, and we live in an expensive city, so. On her Facebook, I saw some details about family members with financial issues she was apparently covering for. It made sense. So my boss hired the second woman because because she had a clean record and nepotism. Lo and behold, we had to fire her in 2 months because she was just terrible at her job. She never came in on time, her projects were all late, did not know how to use Twitter beyond basic use, didn't know how to video edit, big part of the job. Asked to be exempt from giving presentations due to social anxiety. Public speaking is about 40% of the job, and she knew that from the beginning. I mean, she asked me once, "What's an app?" It was bad. First interviewee developed her own app that she did a demo for during her presentation. Later, I figured her webcam page, and I think she's still looking because she had recent logins. The app she developed even took off, and the branding for it is perfectly executed. Her webcam thing not so much, but I don't get the sense she's proud of it. Shame. I know I'd be mostly okay with her working for us, but my boss kept making jokes about me being a perverted creep the last time I brought her application up, so I haven't since. Wasted talent. Story 20. Here goes. My previous job was a weird experience. I was offered a position working it, but weren't really told what my job would be. Get there on my first day to find out we don't even have an office. We are working in a rented space that is most akin to a library. You just pick a spot at the table and do your work. The place was hip, young, and trendy, so it was actually kind of nice. We are working remotely and everything is to be done out of this place. No big deal. My supervisor and I are the only ones from our company in this building, and he is there for just a couple days, train me, and there will be a new guy starting a week, and I have to train him. No big deal. My supervisor was a hilarious guy, and we spent a good portion of the first day talking about guitars. Well, this was a Monday. My supervisor leaves Wednesday, and I'm all alone. I barely know what I'm doing, but I'm gonna kick ass at it. I get to work. New guy starts on Monday. I get all our spreadsheets in order, get a strategy to do our work. Awesome. I'm ready. New guy's a ducking brick. So much hand-holding. He can't do anything on his own. Checks in with me every 5 minutes. I'm not your supervisor, Estefu. Keeps talking about how he plans to get to the airport for his vacation in a month. What if I couldn't possibly care less? He talked about that every good damn day. Last I recall, they were going to get a town car. I suggested a limo. Why the duck not? How many vehicle options are there? Seriously? So after about 2 months of babysitting, I get offered a full-time position elsewhere with the same company. Jump on the opportunity. Other dude gets a job a week later. Damn it. We both need to go get substances tested. We take the train together. He has no idea how to do anything. Seriously, I'm amazed he has been able to keep alive this long without choking on his own saliva. About a week after the substances tests, we all get an email that he's been let go. I'm not surprised because he's not a very capable person. Turns out, that's not the reason. A Google search of his name, and we find that this guy defrauded the quick government of $7 million in equipment in his previous job and had done a couple years of hard time as a result. Now, I can't get into the particulars. I can't explain how he ever passed my company's background check. I don't know. I can't explain how he defrauded the government. It was quite elegant, actually. Or how he got caught. It was quite stupid, actually. However, once we started contracting at the new place and they caught it, he was gone immediately. He always seemed innocent enough, very unassuming. I never would have imagined. Story 21. I did hiring and training for a retailer that was slightly better than Walmart, but we had a steady stream of interesting and dubious applicants as well as employees. Generally, the most interest stuff doesn't happen during the background check, but before and after. Usually due to privacy regulations, employer for large retailers won't get the detail. The corporate office will put in their list of hard no's. If any of those come up, you will receive a letter saying if you'd like the details, you can contact the background check company for more information. The location you applied at will just receive a yes or no verdict on if they are able to hire you. One gentleman came in for an interview and accidentally dropped his wallet. When we opened it to find contact information, we instead found 4 different IDs from 4 different states with 4 different names and 4 different Dobbs, but they were all the same picture. Lucky for him, he noticed his wallet was gone before he left the store and came back to get it. He did not call back to check on his application. There was another gentleman who went through the hiring and interview process, but his behavior was off. He wasn't aggressive and did not appear dangerous, but you could clearly tell something was off. The front-end manager liked to help people who needed help, and he did. He had a son, had been out of a job for a long time, and was having trouble getting hired. She decided to hire him as a parking lot attendant. On the day of his orientation, while I was reading the anti-substances policy, he decided to inform me and the entire class that he used to huff spray paint, but didn't anymore. Not that it wasn't enjoyable, and he assured us he did enjoy it quite a bit when he used to huff. A few months later, Mariah Carey got married, and he informed another manager and myself he was going to go to NYC to give Nick Cannon a piece of his mind because Mariah Carey was his woman. They were destined to have 2 sons, and those 2 sons would marry the Obama girls and start the New World Order. He decided against it when we told him they lived in California, but assured us that he would have his woman. I've also had applicants call the store to inquire of We looked at their application. If we were not going to select them for an interview, we were generally honest about it as well as the reason. Typically, they only wanted to work Monday through Friday 9 to 5, which does not work in retail. I've had numerous applicants cuss at me, berate me, and demand to speak to my boss. To their pain, I would explain that they were talking to the person who made the final decision when it came to who received interviews as well as the person who signed off on hiring for the store, and that it would be best if they sought employment elsewhere. We also had an in-store computer application with a phone by it. There was one woman who kept calling the office every 5 minutes. She couldn't get her job in. She couldn't type this. The last time I came out to assist her, she huffed and demanded I just did it for her, and was very perturbed when I would not. Story 22. Isn't employment, but related. When I had jury duty, everyone got searched on the way into the courtroom. One juror got taken to jail for bringing substances to jury duty. Story 23. Not a background check, but this story literally happened last week. First, let me set the stage. I am 24 and have been working the current job for a little over a year. One of the members on our team was a really good guy and helped train me. He was always joking and seemed to be pretty happy all the time. Well, about 3 weeks ago, someone says he is out sick. The week goes by, and then the next week, he is gone again. At this point, no one really knows why he isn't showing up for work. But we have our team meeting last week and are told that our coworker is no longer with the company, but the head manager will not tell us why. Then, later that day, a coworker calls me over to my desk and says in a whisper, "I found out what happened." She doesn't say anything and just pulls up some Google search results. Our coworker got sentenced to 35 years in prison for assaulting a relative. It was a complete shock to pretty much everyone. Story 24. Well, we had this one guy who told us that he got a DUI, but his lawyer got rid of the charge after we had hired him. On his application, he answered no to the question, "Have you ever been convicted of anything other than a minor traffic violation?" So I decided to simply look on the public records database. His DUI showed up along with domestic violence and a few other things. We let him go the next day. Story 25. I'm not convinced of the value of background checks. My employer doesn't do them anyway. I interviewed one guy who pointed to a 5-year gap in his employment record during the interview and told me that was when he was growing substances. He had picked up lab techniques and was self-employed during that time. Hired, worked out well, worked with another guy who had spent 18 months inside for dealing and was on parole. Fantastic worker and leader. I helped him get promoted. Story 26. I worked as a delivery driver during summer breaks in college. One summer we hired a guy I'll call Gary. Gary was older than most of the guys, but he busted his ass and got crap done. The local bank had a branch 2 blocks down the street, so it was pretty common for guys to run down to the bank on payday and deposit their checks. This was before direct deposit was a common thing. One day, Gary says, "I'm going to run to the bank." The office manager replies with his standard lame joke that we'd all heard 1,000 times. "Bring me back a stack of 20s. Gary gets a weird look on his face and turns completely white before looking down and shuffling out the door quickly. Turns out, Gary fibbed on the application where it asked, "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" He had. Specifically, bank robbery. More specifically, he had robbed the branch of the bank that was right down the street. This eventually came out, and they actually kept him on. As I said, he was a hard worker, and this was a very physical job with high turnover. He was also a whiz of a mechanic, and our ancient refrigerated trucks needed constant attention. He even lost half a finger to a fan while working on one of the reefer units, and never missed a day of work. Gary called in one morning to say he wouldn't be coming in anymore. He lent his car to a friend who got drunk, sheared off a utility pole, and ran off, abandoning the car. Gary was convinced the police wouldn't believe him and would find him in violation of his parole, which would send him back to prison. So he was going on the run. Story 27. I'm in the UK. I was working in retail and we used a contract company for security guarding. The company sent a guard who was pretty decent and did a good job. All contract guards have to be licensed in the UK, which consists of basic training and a full criminal record check. This guard had his legitimate license, and I had checked it out with the Security Industry Authority, SIA. Anyway, my company decided to get rid of the contract company and go with in-house security. This guard applied for a job in-house, and as he knew the job and the store, I was going to take him on. I had to go through an interview with him as a formality. After the interview, I tried calling the guy for a week to tell him he had the job and the start date, but couldn't get hold of him. About 2 weeks later, I got hold of him and he started with us. In-house security do not require a license, but it is my company's policy to do a full disclosure criminal check with security personnel. So I send off the disclosure form, and about 3 weeks later, I get the disclosure back. Usually these are one page, mainly blank with the words "no trace" on the top, defining that there is no criminal history. I got a 4-page history of this guy. He had been convicted of theft from employer numerous times. Drunk driving, driving while disqualified, driving without insurance or without a license, forging a prescription, and numerous theft and fraud offenses. The week in which I couldn't get hold of him was because he was in prison for failing to pay fine. Needless to say, he didn't continue employment, and it makes a farce of the whole SIA system. Really nice guy, though. Story 28, kept a GSM data card from a previous employer, ran up $12,000 worth of data charges, using it as he traveled around another country. Yeah, he didn't even get an interview. Story 29, my father owned a marketing business for a long period of time. He would organize a lot of in-store demos for products, so they were always looking for people in multiple states that could train to learn about the product, and then go into the store to sell that product. He had one guy in his 50s come in. Extremely smart and friendly individual. Automatically clicked with everyone he came into contact with. Had knowledge about multiple products from this company. Even had a few degrees, like 4, higher. Does so well at the store level, my dad brought him into the office to become a trainer. About a year after he was initially hired, things got odd. He was really secretive about his personal life, which wasn't that big of a deal. Was getting into arguments with multiple coworkers out of nowhere, and some products he was set to demo never returned to the office. My dad and his VP decided to do a background check on the guy to see if he had any criminal history regarding theft, etc. Well, there wasn't any theft, but they dug up that he had just served a 20-year jail sentence. Why? He got into an argument with his parents and took them both down and hit when he was in his 20s. They passed. Story 30. My housemate runs background checks on people to be employed by banks mainly. Big 6-figure jobs. He told me once about a guy who had a flag come up on his background check. They could see there was an arrest and charge, but needed his consent to get the details. This can be a lengthy process, so they will accept information volunteered by the client while the process is running on the understanding that if the client has misled them, the application is terminated immediately. He rings the guy, explains the situation, and the guy proceeds to be a complete ass, complaining about being called, telling him how valuable his time is, etc. Eventually, he gives consent, and my housemate starts the process. He explains how he can volunteer the information, etc., and he says, I got arrested for possessing a small amount of weed 2 or 3 years ago. My friend asks for specifics as the time since the crime was important, and was he absolutely sure? The client tells him that he doesn't want to talk about it anymore. He's given him the info he needs, and hangs up on my housemate. The problem is, this bank wouldn't hire anyone with a conviction less than 5 years old. Application instantly terminated. 6-figure job down the drain. It goes to the next applicant. My housemate gets an email back from the background check about a week later because the process wasn't halted for whatever reason, and the conviction was 7 years old. Story 31. One time, while I was working at a nursing home, one of my fellow employees was fired. When I asked my boss what happened, she said the police called and said he was wanted for breaking his parole. Apparently, he had been arrested trying to smuggle substances in Chicago or something, and then ran when he got out. Story 32. At my workplace, a guy got hired on as a computer tech. A week goes by. He's doing great. One morning I arrive and he's gone. I talk to my boss and he shows me why. Boss just happened to be Googling the guy, and there appeared photos of him in prison jumpsuits in a substances rehab program. He hadn't shared that on his application, but then if he had, he would have been weeded out then and there. To clarify, here discovered first that the guy had a felony conviction, and my boss was stuck having to give him the axe. Story 33. This is related sort of. My 8th grade teacher had a warrant out for her arrest for an assault and DUI. She wasn't supposed to drive, didn't have a license, and still drove for multiple school trips. She ended up getting arrested a block away from school. Story 34. For a job in a hospital laboratory, an applicant submitted urine for their initial substances test. It came back as non-human urine. Of all the places you could fool, you really think you would be able to fool a lab? Story 35. Not an employer, but an employee with a dodgy coworker. We worked in a play center for kids. Parents have to be present, and we're basically receptionists, waitresses, etc. So no background checks required. And we got hired at the same time. I thought he was a bit of an odd choice for a kid's play center. He slept in his car and it was full of beer cans, but brushed it off. Then he started talking about how he used supermarket self-service machines to buy flat-screen televisions for the price of carrots, selecting a cheaper item instead of scanning the TV barcode, and how he sold them off black market style to make money. One day he told me that he accidentally got caught up in some protest in Sweden, I think outside an embassy, and ended up getting arrested for it. He hadn't really checked it out as he didn't speak Swedish, or the language the protesters were using. but thought it would be fun to join in. Thankfully, he was sacked after a couple of weeks. I'd love to see what else was on his criminal check. Story 36. I work at a bird farm. We raise game birds like pheasants and quail. We don't generally do background checks on new employees, but a friend of mine said I should do it more often since it could prevent some bad things in the future. So last fall, I had an opening for a new position. Basically, it's called a bird wrangler. Sometimes birds get out of the cages, pens, and then don't know what to do. They stick right next to the cage, pen trying to get back in. So a bird wrangler has to go catch them. It's a pretty simple part-time job. I had a really good applicant. He had stellar letter of recommendation from the local bird club and a family history of working in this line of business. I had practically offered him the job, but was waiting on the background check. Good thing I did. The guy was freaking crazy. At his last employment, he had chased down a bird and eating it raw. I was shocked. Anyways, I made sure to blacklist him in my area. Story 37, not an employer, but I have a fun background check story. When I was in college, I worked through a temp agency during the summers. They liked me, and I was reliable, so I got good assignments. They called offering a choice gig that required a background check. I jump at it. A week passes. Well into the time, they told me I'd be working and no call about when and where to report. I call them and my rep tells me she's really sorry. The job was already done, but got misfiled as current. I accepted the apology, knowing they'd find me something more soon enough. Then my rep adds, "Oh, we did the background check before we realized the mistake. Your record is totally clean, but, somebody else has been using your social security number." Story 38. Used to do hiring for a very large alcoholic beverage distributor. We had a policy that we didn't care what was on anybody's record, as long as it wasn't theft, and as long as they told us about it in the interview. We had one guy come in, mid-40s, long hair, tons of tattoos. He wanted to work in a warehouse, building pallets, and he was perfect for it. Good build, and seemed like he had a good work ethic. We get to the part where we explain that we want to know anything on the record, because we always check, and honesty is the most important factor in a workplace. This dude looks at us, and without hesitation. Well, I got out of prison 3 months ago after serving 25 years for homicide. Turns out, back when he was 19, he had gotten drunk and hit his boss in a fight. I thanked him for his honesty and continued the interview. Afterwards, he still honestly seemed like a great candidate, but corporate told us we couldn't make the hire. We helped him get a job at one of the locally owned liquor stores, and I believe he's still there. Story 39, I have a big one. At a public policy type job I had years ago, a resume was circulated just in case any of us were hiring. The applicant was new to our country and had held the position of justice minister in a country well known for war, violence, etc., etc. Curious, I talked to someone I knew in a relevant government department and to the National Office of Amnesty International. Turns out the applicant was basically a warlord who was part of the losing side in an ugly civil war. As a quick conclusion, it was a borderline evil but clueless colleague who circulated the warlord's CV, along with her handwritten recommendation that he might be a good candidate for something. I resisted the urge to embarrass her over it, but I did return it to her with a note that she might want to be careful about who she recommends. Story 40. Okay, I had a job in medical HR many years ago, and all the doctors we employed had to pass a police record check in order to start working with patients. We had one young doctor, she was a slim, sporty-looking blonde, quite shy, whose crib check came back with big red text on it, with the equivalent of an outstanding warrant for smuggling kak into Thailand. The poor kid was hauled in to meet with the HR managerial team and other important bigwigs, and it turned out that her passport had been stolen while she was traveling and used in the substances trafficking trade. She'd had this problem with every single placement and job she'd applied for and had legit and solid evidence that she had been back in the UK and working at the time of the offense. But technicalities meant that it was still showing up on her police records check, and she had no way of removing it. I felt really bad for her. That's going to dog her for the rest of her life, and it's no fault of hers. Story 41. Not a BG check, but I've been off-site for the last few months at this prototyping supplier my company hired to develop our injection mold tools for this project I'm on. So, like 2 weeks back, they hired in a new head of sales. Kind of a chump, but whatever. Nothing significant seemed chill. But then the other day, one of the two secretaries mentioned in passing that he had a nice phone. Some big-ass Galaxy something or other. Big screen, good definition, all that jazz. And the guy goes, "You should see how dirty film looks on it." And then, I crap you not, proceeded to load a video and show it to her in the middle of the front office. Owner caught wind of it like 30 minutes later, fired him on the spot. Best day I've had at work in 2 months. Story 42. Not exactly scandalous, and I'm not the employer, but at the Dallas Zoo, some lady put on her resume for the butterfly garden. I love all of God's children, even though I know butterflies are not animals. Story 43. We had an application come through and it had a number of red lights. Applicants stated they lost a job due to a month in jail, but there was a 6-year employment gap. They also walked in for info on the position. That usually is a flag also. We need people that can drive, and usually walking means no license. We hadn't run the bay, and we're about to, but I did some searching first, and there she was, lifelong offender. 2 Deweys are enough to not get hired, but throw in the whole abuse thing. Nope. Story 44. Not an employer, but I had a job as a maintenance guy in junior college. One of my coworkers was a guy in his late 40s. It being junior college, I just thought he was going back to school to get some education, so he could get a better job. He mentioned he used to work in a factory. One day, while we're up in an abandoned administration building, removing old office furniture, just the 2 of us, he mentions to me that he shot his next-door neighbor in the head after he heard his neighbor beating his Jeff again. Just knocked on the door and popped him. He had just gotten out of prison and was going back to school, so he could get a nice job. He was a totally chill dude, though, when I worked with him. Very humble, polite, worked hard in classes and on the job. Just to hear him say something like that nonchalantly was just like, holy crap, dude. Nearly dropped the desk I was carrying. Story 45. I've never actually employed anyone myself, but one of the places I worked at never did background checks until an incident they had. It was a crap restaurant job, and they hired mostly high school kids. One of the managers was a registered offender, and they found out when a customer brought in one of the info sheets you can get online. Turns out our little restaurant was right down the street from a school, and it violated his probation. After that, they started doing more background checks on employees. Story 46. I worked with a cook for a while. I left the job for school, and when I came back for winter break, he was gone. Apparently, earlier that week, he had been arrested for having tens of thousands of files of CP. He had been a really nice guy from what I knew of him. Everyone I talked to was completely shocked. Story 47. I am on the other side of this coin, if you will. While I was fortunate enough to get a job right out of prison dismantling cars at a junkyard, I have not been able to get past the background check, ever. Actually, since I always disclose my past, I guess I never make it to the background check. One time, I was pretty close to getting a job, but they withdrew the offer after the background check came back despite the fact that I had fully disclosed my convictions and prison time on the initial application and talked with the interviewer about them. I thought that was weird. It was as if they didn't believe me when I told them I'd been convicted, offered me a job, then decided not to go through with it after they saw that I wasn't kidding. Story 48. My grandfather owns a trailer park. I know. Let it out. It's okay to laugh. And I spent a summer living with my aunt and uncle in the area. He came over one evening and was complaining that for the second time that summer, the police had raided his park for someone wanted for a crime that he was renting to. I showed him how to do background checks online that evening, and the next day he left work to come and find me. Because he thought he did it wrong, why? He decided to try it on one of his long-standing tenants that he was on good terms with, always paid their bill on time, kept their lawn neat, etc. They were a pedo. He has children living in the trailer park. Yeah, in short, that was the summer his trailer park was raided 3 times by the police. Story 49. When I was a manager at Pizza Hut, I had a guy come in to drop off an application. I would usually ask a few perfunctory questions when people turned in applications so I could get a feel for whether it was going to be worth my time to set up an interview, availability, how many hours they were looking for, willing to work weekends, etc. Well, this guy comes in and he seems a little off. After a couple of minutes, he explains that the checked, yes on felony question because of a DUI, which wouldn't be a problem if he can get to work on time. But then he nonchalantly adds that he also has a conviction for domestic violence, but it's not as bad as it sounds. Technically, it was just assault. Needless to say, I never called that guy back. Story 50. For a short while, I managed a movie theater. I was interviewing some kids, 16 to 20-ish, to replace some vacancy. I asked one kid during the interview, "Why do you want to work here?" He said, "I need a real job, so the IRS doesn't bust me." Apparently, he made most of his money dealing substances and needed something that would look legit as to why, at 18, he rents an apartment by himself and owns 2 cars. Anyhow, I ended up hiring him on the policy that he cannot carry nor sell substances while is working. If I catch him once, he's out, and I call the cops. Single best employee I ever had. Dude worked hard, was smart, honest. I once called him to cover a no-show. He said he couldn't because he was high. Busted another coworker for stealing. All around great kid. Story 51. This is going to get buried, but one of my jobs said they got bonuses for hiring convicted felons. I thought it was kind of cool, the whole give people a second chance. Except it was the cafe at my school. Story 52. I had a double-header trying to fill in construction estimator position. The first applicant just got out of prison for defrauding some cities and counties on construction contracts. Not quite the right person for an estimator. Then the next guy turned out to have an offender background. On this one, HR was willing to let the guy explain the situation. Maybe he was 18 and she was 17, etc. But he firmly said no and walked out. Story 53. Meh, I have some pretty mixed emotions about this topic. A good friend of mine was once convicted on marijuana possession charges in his early 20s. At some point, he got a job at a call center after omitting this fact on his resume. He was good at his job and reliable. And a couple years later, he was up for promotion. They did a background check at this point and found the substance's conviction. He lost his job over it. Some people are dangerous or shouldn't be considered for certain jobs due to their history. On the other hand, some people have made mistakes in their lives despite the fact that they are hard workers and good people, and it's a shame that these past mistakes prevent them from improving their lives later. Story 54. We didn't find out till after we fired this guy. We weren't doing them when he was hired. Not a bad dude, calm and polite. Turns out every story he told us was a lie, because he just got out of prison for murdering. Served 20 years for it. Story 55. Sometimes I get crap because in my same state within an hour of my hometown, some guy has the same name I do. I have a pretty rare name, so you don't see it very often. This dude was convicted of assaulting. When people do goggle searches on my name, the articles about his trial are first on the list. It helps now that he is in jail for decades, but sometimes they have to do a closer look to clear me. Story 56. I did a background check on a construction worker and found the following confusing combination: abuse, stalking, securities, investment fraud. I imagined that he was a debauched 80s guy and dubbed him Patrick Bateman. Story 57. My boss hired a guy for a cashier position. Seemed like an okay dude. Little weird, aren't we all? He caught on pretty quick. I mean, come on, it's a ducking cashier position, not that hard. He had another job and always showed up for his shifts on time. One day he was a no-call, no-show. We thought, okay, no big deal, it happens. But he didn't show up for his next 3 shifts. My boss basically left him a voicemail and fired him. The next day we saw on the news, Pizza Boy has sex, and his mugshot was right next to the headline. He had sex with the family dog and it was all caught on camera. Crazy people. Story 58. At my last job, I hired first interviews. We routinely hired folks from halfway houses and fresh out of jail, so we didn't mind the odd felony. Hell, it was almost a prerequisite. Anyways, the first interview I ever did at the job was 2 guys who were at a local halfway house, and both checked the felony box. When I asked why, the first guy told me he just got done with an 8-year sentence for robbing a bank. The second guy just got done with a sentence for robbing a gun store. I told them we'd call them back if anything opened up. Story 59. My aunt's husband had his identity stolen by his identical twin brother. The twin proceeded to commit a bunch of felonies, so that shows up on every background check. I should add he has a super common name, like John Smith level of common, so it doesn't come up when you Google him, just during an in-depth background check. Story 60. I had a nice normal guy, middle-aged, very well-mannered. Was just about to offer him a new extended contract when I realized I had to do a background check. Turned out he convicted arsonist, and I actually went to the high school he burned down. Story 61. I didn't have anything to do with this, but we had a guy that was about to get a job as site manager, which pays 6 figures and everything checked out as far as experience and references. However, he put that he had some advanced degree from some fancy sounding school. That didn't check out. Turns out he made it up. That element to his resume played very little part to him, almost getting the job, but because he made crap up, my company didn't give him the job. Story 62. Forcible abuse involving a firearm. It was a guy who I hired as a telemarketer through a temp agency. He seemed like a nice enough guy and was extremely good on the phone. He worked his way up, and I offered him a permanent position with the company. I sent his paperwork into HR. A few days later, I got a call from the head of HR saying escort the guy off the premises. We also stopped doing business with the temp agency as our agreement stipulated screening. Story 63. After mentioning to my wife that you really have to be aware of your own personal online presence, I received an application while we were shopping. After a quick Google search on my phone, I knew that the applicant had a history of substances use and stole from a previous employer to feed their habit. Story 64. My Git-nephew got caught shoplifting from a local store 2 years ago. Recently, he applied for a job there and got hired. They have new management now. On his first day of work, one of the other employees recognized him and talked to the manager, who then looked in the system and sure enough saw he was banned from the store for shoplifting. They pulled him into the office and fired him. I was amazed he even had the balls to go apply there, knowing Thee was banned from the store. Story 65. We had a guy get hired for the NOC in the hospital I worked for. He vanished after a week on the job, and we found out he had been a nurse previously and was convicted for patient abuse. They hired him prior to the background check coming in, apparently. Story 66. Not an employer, but but I can tell you that as an employee, I've been called back and told I couldn't work at a place because my background check wasn't clean. I'm looking at all these posts and realizing my misdemeanors aren't really that bad. Illegal lodging, I was homeless for a few years, yet I still don't get any jobs or callbacks. Story 67. Oh, boom, I can shine in this thread. I was doing interviews for a shop I used to work in. One of the women was in her mid-30s. Really good interview. She was even pretty. When we finished up, one of the staff at the time tells me he recognized her from a website. She was a 60 pounds an hour escort in her spare time. Story 68. Being desperate for staff, I hired a guy over the phone to start next day. His look said it all. 2 weeks in, he tells me he spent 17 years in Max Pen for holding a family hostage in their home, while his accomplice took the father to his jewelry store to rob it. I was old enough to remember the news story. Story 69. A man who worked for Wells Fargo was hired and then fired after they found out about his criminal past. He put a fake coin in a machine at a laundromat in the 60s. Glad they caught that sick duck. Story 70. In New Zealand, it takes a little over 3 weeks to get a criminal background check, so we had already hired this particular individual. He was a bit strange, but nothing too far from the norm. That is, until I found out that he had been convicted of assaulting. We fired him that afternoon. Story 71. I did a background check today, and the lady, who is now a nurse, was picked up for escort 4 times. Yes, we hired her. It was over 10 years ago, and I believe in giving people a chance. I was seriously cringing for her, though. Story 72. I did hiring for the 2010 census. We hired a large number of people who had felonies on their records because they had admitted to it before the background check. If they were negligent in reporting their history, they were disqualified, however. I now understand why people do not want to talk to census enumerators. Story 73. My stepmom's nephew's friend was trying to become a cop, and when they did the interview, they asked him, "Have you ever tried substances?" He replied with, "Yes." Employers of Reddit, what is the weirdest or creepiest thing you found during a background check on a potential employee? Years ago, was interviewing someone who listed being a supervisor at a Starbucks as part of her resume. Asked her to share a story about tough conflict resolution. She shares that she caught an employee stealing. She said it was tough because she couldn't tell anyone. Why? Because it would get him in trouble. Okay, so how did you deal with it? I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't stop. So then, whenever he was going to steal something, I did it for him so he wouldn't get in trouble. There was no sense of wrongdoing on her part. No guilt. Seemed kind of proud of her answer, perhaps thinking I would be quite impressed with how she handled it. I walked out and had a hard time figuring out if this was one of those fancy interview consultants that higher-ups sent to see how we react, or if she was just nuts. Story 2. One time, we had this girl come in for an interview and she killed it. Super friendly, professional, well-spoken, and she had experience. Googled her name and immediately found a video of her stealing from the local sex toy place. The company posted it online, and all the comments consisted of people naming her because she was well known in the student community. I never felt such intense, secondhand embarrassment, and while she was obviously in the wrong to steal, the company publicly shaming her was so unprofessional. Anyway, I hear she moved away after that. Poor girl. Story 3. I was a hiring manager for a while at my place of employment. Had a decent candidate. He was applying for an overnight position, so his slight lack of social skills wasn't too bad. He had a decent work history and told us he'd been through a recent divorce and had been down on his luck for a while, which explained an 18-month gap in employment. He answered no to the conviction question. His substances test was fine, so I started his background check and told him we'd bring him back in to finish up paperwork once it was returned. 4 days later, the check was still pending, which usually suggests that the candidate has some sort of record and our HR dept is investigating. A week and a half passes and candidate has called a few times asking what's up. I have no answer. Finally, I get the big "do not hire" on his status, as well as an email from HR. The email was basically along the lines of, "Do not hire candidate. Do not contact candidate. If candidate comes into your location, insist he leaves immediately." I never saw the guy after that, and I don't know what they found. Story 4. Got a resume for a vet tech position from someone with an MD. Well, that just doesn't make sense, so I Googled her. Turns out she'd lost her license and spent the last 6 years in prison for dealing prescription medics. Story 5. I was hiring for a mid-level technology-related position, and a middle-aged guy applied. He had a decently relevant background, so I called him in for an interview. You know how they say to bring printed copies of your resume to an interview? This guy had brought several copies printed on resume paper, bound in one of those document folders with the clear front page, along with reference letters and app kinds of other stuff. He was really earnest throughout the interview, like trying way too hard. Otherwise, he does relatively okay, but definitely not better than the maybe pile. At the end, he decides to straight up drop the bombshell that he's a convicted offender. Then, he decided to try and reassure us, like that somehow made it better. Then, he proceeded to tell us about all the tax benefits that would be available to us for hiring him. It was really strange story 6. One just came up, but it was not an employee, but someone who is threatening a friend of mine. I have to keep a lot of details vague, but I think the gist will come across. In my industry, we have guests for our event. Some of them are well-known actors and writers, some are famous industry folks, and then there's a lot of people who are on the tail edge of fame who are known for one thing like a YouTube channel or something. Someone applied to be a guest at her event. Let's call him Dave, who has a list of credits that seem dubious. Dave claims to have been a game designer, listing several popular legacy cult games, along the lines of Duke Nukem, Quake, N64, James Bond, Pokemon Stadium, that sort of thing. All of them belong to the same big league company. Let's call it Panasonic. Dave also claims to have been in a few Panasonic productions as a voice actor, script editor, and so on. Dave has several awards under his belt from Panasonic. Dave has been a guest at several conventions. Dave has created several conventions in the span of his career, so she looked them up. None of the games have him listed in the credits. The span of what he's claimed to work on, when subtracted from his age, would mean he started working for Panasonic when he was just 9 years old. His link to his IMDb page does not exist. When you cross-reference him to his acting and writing, only his name comes up in his own credits, like his Facebook page, listings under guest details at a few small conventions, his own website. Same with these Panasonic Excellence Awards, which do not exist at Panasonic. And we have industry contacts who can verify such things in a single phone call. The only reference to them are the same as his self-posted credit above. Dave's conventions guest listings can only be 50% verified. Big, well-known conventions don't have him listed at all. Small conventions have him listed, but we're talking 100 to 200 people. One-day events at a local college small. The rest are his own convention. His own conventions have locations and addresses that are either hard to verify, veteran halls, elk lodges, hotel function rooms, or downright don't exist as function space. One can have an event, restaurants, storage facilities, vacant lots, or non-existent. There are a few people like this in our industry. The sad thing is that he's one of the few who have convinced a fan base to promote him, and if you turn him down, he'll demand to know why. If you tell him nothing you claim seems verifiable, he'll lose his crap. He'll threaten you, he'll claim libel, and he'll sue you. Story 7. Wasn't in charge of hiring, but I used to run background checks for potential workers and volunteers at an animal shelter. A middle-aged guy wanted to volunteer, and we have to make sure the people don't have any history of animal abuse, among other things. Found a nasty assault and theft charge against him from 10 years prior, and after that it was like the guy completely disappeared off the radar. Had to call and ask him to explain what he did during those years, because there might be a mistake. Couldn't get a hold of him. A couple more days pass and I see his mugshot on the news. He was in prison and had just escaped 2 days prior to wanting to volunteer. Was on the run. Story 8. This happened to me in February 2016. This woman interviewed with me, and I made her an offer contingent on her passing a state background check. She suddenly tries telling me I don't need to run one on her which I reply I absolutely need to, and it was state regulation. She let it go. I run the background, which takes about 2 full business days before I can get the results and leave my office for the weekend. Come back on the Wednesday afterwards, and the background is waiting. There were more red flags than I've ever seen. This was a few of things that came back. 1. Criminal harassment. 2. A pending felony DUI with leaving the scene of an accident. 3. Endangering the welfare of a child. I obviously call the woman and tell her we would not be able to hire her. And she wigs out on the phone, calling me a liar and other nonsense. So I calmly read all of her information she gave me back to her, and she confirmed it all, but couldn't explain the results. I stand by my decision and tell her good luck. Wasn't done though, unfortunately. I leave for lunch and come back to my secretary, telling me that I had a couple there to see me. Lady shows up with her boyfriend and tries to combo guilt, intimidate me into changing my mind. I read her the state regulations verbatim and tell her it could cost us our provider number. I wish I was making this next part up. With this guy present, she offers me a BJ to overlook all of this and hire her. At this point, I tell her to leave my office and tell her not to come back. I tell my secretary under no circumstances to let them back into the building and call the executive director and owner to tell them about what happened. During the call, I get a post-it note from my secretary who tells me that the couple are out in the parking lot looking around at cars, and she called the police. Cops show up and they think of some BS excuse like lost their keys in the lot. I immediately tell the police what happened and they escorted them off the property. Story 9. One of the first things we do is Google you and check out your FB. My favorite profile picture was of this girl's butt. Zoomed in, lacy underwear. Made me laugh. Lock down your FB and have a decent profile picture before you turn in your resume. Story 10, my chance. I ran a background check on a completely respectable woman with a good resume wearing a nice suit. When we got it back, it included escort, substances possession, intent to sell, threats, 3 DUIs, and several indecent exposure charges. I had to call her and tell her it wouldn't work out. She couldn't figure out why not for the life of her. Story 11. Many years ago, made an offer to someone in the healthcare field. His background check was fine, but his state licensure dragged on, so we couldn't let him work until then. License never came through because after we had run the background check, he hit his grandmother, who he lived with. Story 12 was interviewing potential candidates for a driving position. 60-year-old male comes in, wins me over, heart and soul. Just a real dedicated guy. Really professed the love of his family. Extremely polite. Background search revealed several substances charges and armed robberies from over 20 years ago. I really wanted to hire him anyway, but that was a huge no-go at my company. Story 13. My story doesn't exactly fit the question because I was not the employer in the case, but it's along the same line. I used to work in a place that also provided volunteer employment for men getting out of prison to give them retail experience and something to put on their resume. We were not generally told what sort of offenses the men were incarcerated for. Our supervisor knew, but the employees were not given that information. However, a lot of the time, they would tell us themselves. Usually it was things like substances charges or fraud. There was one man, however, that always stood out. He seemed very well-educated, well-spoken, very organized. I'm not saying that well-educated people never go to prison. Of course they do. However, the men we usually dealt with generally didn't fit that description. My coworkers and I were all curious what kind of crime he might have committed. One day, one of my coworkers happened to see a piece of paper or something with his name on it. We usually only knew them by their first name. He decided to Google it. Obviously, we are not supposed to do that, hence the no last names policy. But he did anyway and discovered that this guy had hit one of his foster children. We were all a little shocked. I had a hard time working with him after that, but luckily he was only with us for a few months. He never did tell us himself what he had done, and of course we couldn't say anything. It was awkward though. Story 14. Girl was hired before her background check results came back as the position desperately needed to be filled. 2 days later, she was let go once it came out that she had been convicted of illegally substances. Her explanation was that someone had overdosed in her so's home, and they didn't want to be charged for that. Story 15. Interviewed a woman once, and it went pretty well. I had a cubicle, so we used my boss' office, since my boss was out of town. She gives the right answers and had related experience in a somewhat specialized field. Calm, composed, generally on point. Mentally, I had placed her in the top 2 contenders. When I got back to my desk from dropping her off at the elevator bank, there's an email from HR with the subject line, "Please call us immediately." The voicemail light is also flashing. What follows are a series of gradually more panicked messages from the HR rep, starting with, "Hello, Alan. This is your HR rep, hoping to catch you before your interview. Call me," ending with, "Alan, call me right now." Apparently, when the candidate came in, HR made a mistake and sent her on the wrong interview with another manager, offering a similar position, but not the one she was looking for. She figured this out abruptly and somewhat rudely ended the interview, then went back to HR. This manager called up HR and said, "Hey, there's been a mistake, but you should know this person went kind of bonkers." In HR, the candidate screamed at the assistant, called her names like stupid and retarded, then insisted on going on the interview with me. The assistant was a newbie and sent her on the correct interview, then went into her boss's office and broke down in tears. The calls were various H people trying to locate this person and have her escorted from the building. Story 16. I've got some weird employment stories, but here's one of the more unusual. I had recently been hired via a contracted group for an IT-related job. Long story short, I was sitting in orientation the first day, getting assigned a user ID and such. The very basics. They did the substances tests already, so everyone had been cleared, but because they were rushing to get a group in, background checks had not all been cleared. There's a knock at the door of the training room. Local sheriffs step in and ask for the guy who happens to be sitting right next to me. He was a young kid, maybe 20 or 21 if I had to guess. He stands up and leaves. The rest of the day we made a few jokes about whether we should box up his things. The trainer tells us he won't be returning and doesn't comment further. A few days later, there's an article in the paper the kid had, a warrant for his arrest for a murder charge. As if things weren't already a little crazy. About a week later, a surveillance tape is released on the news that this kid shot someone in broad daylight in what seemed like a small robbery. Was pretty crazy, piecing everything together once I realized it all. Story 17. My manager told me a story about an interview he had with a candidate that was perfect. Near the end, they had already decided he was the guy and started talking more casually about what he did in his free time. His response to, "What's your favorite hobby?" was escort. He didn't get the job. Story 18. Not an hour, but I sit next to them and often hear amazing tales. Weirdest one I can think of was a guy who on his resume listed a special skill of "I can tell if someone has diarrhea just by their smell," along with an extensive explanation of his ability to diagnose gastrointestinal problems by using his nose on a resume. Googling his name led in turn to various fetish websites, and well, he was out of the running. Story 19. Kind of the other side of the coin. I live in a very small country in Southeast Asia. My name is common in my home Western country, but stands out as foreign here. When you Google my name in this Asian country, there immediately comes up about 50 references to a jailed pedo in the country's capital. He's also from my home country and about my same age. It creeps me out to think that my employer, prospective employer, or new friends might make a misconnection if they try to check me out on Google. Story 20. I was a hiring manager for a seasonal store. We only actually did background checks on anyone applying for management, but during my interviews, I had to ask the applicants if they could pass a background check. As long as they said yes, they were clear. Bad logic, right? So during the season, one of my employees let it slip. She wouldn't pass a background check. I wasn't overly worried about it and assumed she just had some substances charges or something. Out of curiosity, I Googled her name that night and learned she had been arrested for escort over 10 times in 3 months. Several years prior, she also had a charge for continuing to prostitute after she found out she had HIV. After this, I got super curious about everyone else and ended up Googling all of them. One of my associates had a charge from several years prior where he and his cousin had broken into an elderly couple's home and kidnapped the gentleman, driving him to an ATM and having him withdraw money for them. Story 21. A few years ago, we had this really creepy guy, around 25 years old, working with us. One night he leaves at the same time as another employee, 17F, and walks her to her car. She said she got in her car and he was leaning on her door. The door was open and he was standing in front of it on her side, and she couldn't shut it. He kept talking to her for about 20 minutes and would pout when she would say she had to leave. Finally, she convinces him she has to go home, and the next day at work, she tells everyone how creeped out she was by him. One of our coworkers had a strange feeling and went home that night and Googled him. He was a registered offender. He was promptly fired by management for lying on his application. The part where it asks if you've ever been convicted of a felony, he checked no. Story 22. We hired a temp who seemed really sketchy. She dressed okay, but smelled like she took a bath in perfume. She had the attention span of a gnat, but I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. She went to lunch and I found her FB, and she looked super strung out in all the pics. She comes back from lunch 2 hours later saying she got lost. She didn't drive. She hung out in the parking lot after work for an hour and a half till our office admin called her a cab. One of the girls finds her on FB and says she's friends with a mutual acquaintance who says she's super into heroin. She shows up the next day and is sleeping at the desk with the girl training her. She says it's some new meds. I escorted her out the door at that point. Story 23, throwaway response, kind of on subject. I have a criminal record and have managed to find work over the years, partly because I worked behind bars and I was self-employed for a while. Also partly because I now live permanently in Europe and they can't get to my criminal history. What's worrying to me is that I've now found a career that I really enjoy over here, working with children. My criminal record didn't show on my now home nation's check. I have not yet had to fill an application form, so haven't lied. I just hope that, as laws become more tight, it doesn't come up, and if it does, they will overlook it. And just to clarify, my conviction was for fraud. I got overpaid a lot of money when I noticed I made the wrong choice and spent it, then tried to cover my tracks when the questions started. It's nothing dodgy, but I don't announce at parties. Story 24. Was hiring somebody who put a different name on his application than the one in his passport. He was using his passport as proof of eligibility to work in the UK. I asked him about this, and he said he'd changed his name recently, but didn't offer up a reason as to why. He seemed like a lovely guy and was more than qualified for the position, but I decided to Google his original name just to make sure. First few hits were news stories from local papers about him being a notorious football hooligan and having been to prison for hit a 60-year-old man in a pub. I believe in second chances, but he knowingly lied on his application, which told me that he probably hadn't changed. Story 25. Interviewed a guy for a night stocking position that required a certain amount of independent work because the night team was a pretty skeleton crew, maybe 3-4 people tops for a large store all night. The boss was former RKMP and really strict about having people pass background checks, especially for positions where they'd be handling money or spending a lot of time alone. This guy swore up and down that the only thing in his record was a DUI from 15 years previously. He'd changed his life, been to rehab, etc., and it would be fine. Crim check came back with literally over a dozen convictions, multiple DUIs, theft, assault, parole violations, failure to appear, you name it. It was a smorgasbord of crap. Called him back to ask WTF. He said, "Oh, I didn't think any of that would show up." Story 26. When my mom had her business, she was letting me recruit people because of my, as she calls it, computer skills. So one day a guy applied and seemed nice at first. The interview was going well. He was all suited up and classy. After checking his documents, I did some research on him. Couldn't find anything about that guy before 2013. 2 days later, when we interviewed some more people, we were interrupted by the police, asking if they could ask some questions. They showed us a pic of the guy that was applying and asked if we know where he is. So we gave them all the documents he left there for us. Turned out he was searched for murdering and identity theft. Well, some days later found him and they informed us. We still don't know why he applied for a job at our business, but I don't even want to know why. Story 27. So I worked at Rite Aid as a pharmacist, and we were looking for a pharmacy tech. Girl comes in with face tattoos, and I don't know how many piercings. My dip crap pharmacy manager hires her because at least she has experience. Background check came back okay. She had an attitude and was terrible with customers. A former tech who moved on to work with the town police did his own check on her and found a few assault records and her mugshot. He told us to Google it, and there it was. Dip crap manager still didn't fire her. Took an hour intervention to get her to put on indefinite suspension. 2 months later, she contacted me to ask if I could be a reference for a job in Chicago. It's so hard. Story 28. Trucking company a few years back. With a lack of drivers, we were told, if he has a pulse, he is 80% in. So we fast-tracked this guy. Monday, 3-day orientation. He is a full 100% driver by Friday. As we are booking him a load, he said, next Tuesday he has to be home. Ask him why. Driver, I got a court date. Me, okay, assuming it is a minor thing. Can you go back out on Thursday? Driver, I don't know, depends on the judge. Me, what do you mean? Driver, I am up for double attempted murder. Fired before his first trip. Story 29. I wasn't doing the hiring, but my coworker was. A girl came in and interviewed for my work, and everything went really well. And my coworker was planning on hiring her. A few days later, there's a news article with her face on it. Apparently she attacked someone. We were pretty shook. Story 30. We were hiring people to be security officers and had one guy that did great on interview and was a shoo-in. When we got the background back, we found out he had just recently gotten out of jail for stealing airplanes and currently had a warrant out for his arrest. Job service thought he would be a good fit for security. Story 31. I'm not the employer, but I remember the whole situation. A new salesman was needed in a small but growing company. The advert went out and they interviewed multiple candidates. One was successful and he joined. He was ex-RAF and seemed to be a decent being until a fellow staff member decided to Google him and see what comes up. I do this. He had been in prison for fraud, selling false insurance to young drivers. This was serious as our company dealt with insurance companies and similar clients. He was fired and kicked out on the spot. Story 32. I'm a healthcare recruiter. A surprising amount of RNNs were once prostitutes, at least in Milwaukee. Also, FB is where the real dirt comes out. Yeah, it's true. Employers can't discriminate based on it, but they all do. If you talk about substances, baby daddy drama, partying, and crap-talking your employers on social media, don't expect your career to go far. Story 33. Had a guy's background check come up with explosives charge once. According to him, he had fireworks in the state of California, and they don't really mess around.